Chief Justice John Roberts spoke out against lawmakers who use heated rhetoric and warned about the rise of violent threats against judges.
Here's Roberts at the judicial conference in Charlotte, North Carolina.
I mean, I've been compelled over the past few years to make statements about people on one side of the aisle, their reviews on judges, and on the other side. It's not politically associated in any way with one side or the other. The danger, of course, is somebody might pick up on that, and we have had, of course, serious threats of violence and murder of judges just simply for doing their work. So I think the political people on both sides of the aisle need to keep that in mind.
The Supreme Court last week handed President Trump a major win by limiting district court judges from issuing nationwide injunctions. In the 6-3 ruling along ideological lines, the justices said that for the most part, judges can't grant relief past the people who brought the lawsuit in the first place. For the relief to extend beyond the immediate people involved, the lawsuit would have to convert into a class action.
The legal battle was over Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship to children born to parents who are illegal immigrants or on short-term visas. Notably, Justices Ketanji Brown Jackson and Amy Coney Barrett sparred in their dueling arguments. Justice Jackson called the ruling an existential threat to the rule of law and wrote in part, quote, "It is not difficult to predict how this all ends. Eventually, executive power will become completely uncontainable and our beloved constitutional republic will be no more."
Justice Barrett, on the other hand, argued, "We observe only this. Justice Jackson decries an imperial executive while embracing an imperial judiciary. No one disputes that the executive has a duty to follow the law, but the judiciary does not have unbridled authority to enforce this obligation. In fact, sometimes the law prohibits the judiciary from doing so." So obviously a huge win for Trump in this birthright citizenship case, which was confusing to some people because it's not really about birthright citizenship, but about the use of nationwide injunctions to block policies coming from the executive branch. There's been something like 60 to 70, it could be even higher, I'm guesstimating here, nationwide injunctions against some of President Trump's executive orders. So for those to be limited in scope or to be lifted entirely is obviously hugely important for his domestic policy agenda.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I know commentators on the left and right have been pointing out that liberal justices have previously called out these nationwide injunctions.
Yeah, Elena Kagan in particular.
And now they're in favor of it. I've been consistent on this. I think it's important from a checks and balances and separation of power standpoint that these district court judges can issue nationwide injunctions to allow, for there to be separation of powers. I think that's super important. And I think in Democratic presidents, you see justices talk about this, and often you see it flipped under Republican presidents. Now, I saw Scott Jennings on CNN call out, I think it was Justice Jackson for being, or Kagan for being a partisan hack. And if he wants to use that term, he should definitely apply it to Justice Thomas and a number of the conservative justices who've been absolutely partisan hacks over the next few years, not to mention some of the ethical issues they've had. So I think very few justices have been consistent, including on this issue. The other thing, the other piece of this issue, of course, is dealing with birthright citizenship, which is in the Constitution, and I think it's not conservative, not libertarian, not a constitutional originalist position to want to end that. I think it's been settled law for a long time. So I think that piece of the issue is problematic as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's been settled for like 30 or 40 years, but certainly not since the conception of America. And I think the question is that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, what does that actually mean? And I actually think it's really great that the Supreme Court is going to finally settle that matter, because it has been kind of fuzzy for a long time. But I wanted to ask about your claim that justices like Alito and Thomas have been partisan hacks. What are some of the examples of them flipping on an issue like Kagan did?
What comes to mind first is the ethical issues, and you have, for example, Justice Thomas's wife being directly involved in the Stop the Steal efforts in 2020. You see Justice Thomas taking all kinds of trips with donors, and I think that to me is very problematic. And I think one of the most disastrous decisions that they've made is around money in politics that has allowed this unlimited amount of spending to happen in our politics. There's even more corruption happening. So I think that when there's a Republican president, there is a very strong opinion around the federal use of power and the federal government on the part of conservative justices. When there's a Democratic president, there tends to be a lot more of an interest in states' powers and states' rights among conservative justices, and that's where you see the flip-flopping happening.
I mean, I do think it's important to point out that when Thomas had taken a trip with Harlan Crow, which is the billionaire you're referring to, there were no ethical rules related to what he was doing, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
And Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a lot of similar issues where she was receiving gifts and trips from wealthy friends. So I don't view that as an ethical issue because it wasn't against the rules at that time. Now, if he were to do it after they revised the rules, that would be a different story. And I also don't think it's fair to conflate what he does with his wife's political activity.
Yeah, well, I think like when you run for office or you serve in a position of federal office, you do have to disclose your financial holdings not only of yourself but also of any spouses as well. And so there is an idea that your spouses often can financially profit on decisions being made because there is insider information that you have. So I do think actually spouses are partially responsible for.
Yeah, but your contention was that she was involved in the Stop the Steal protests, not that she had a conflict of interest financially. Right,
but I also think that political actions that spouses are taking, especially when your husband is ruling on a very consequential decision federally for elections, is something that needs to be taken into account. I also take your point that you're right. Taking these trips with major donors, not illegal, but normatively it's wrong. I've been calling for ethics reforms for members of the Supreme Court for a long time. There's a reason why we have gift rules on members of Congress. It just has not been updated to the point where it should apply to Supreme Court justices. But if you, and this is polled as well, if the American people learn about what Supreme Court justices are doing and some of the trips and donor gifts they're able to get, it is obviously corrupt and it should stop.
I think one of the biggest problems for me about the ProPublica reporting about Clarence Thomas is that they were never able to demonstrate that these trips changed his opinion on any case. He was just as conservative before the trips as he was after, and I think has been pretty consistent. Unfortunately, we didn't even have time to get to the parents being allowed to opt out of LGBTQ storybooks in school, age verification laws for porn sites, and Medicaid spending for Planned Parenthood, but hopefully another time. Up next, Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial has been postponed for 2 weeks after a social media post from Donald Trump. We'll talk about it next.